All right, everybody, welcome back. In this video, we are going to be pulling in our first React hook to kind of refactor some of this bloated code that we have on our editor in our application right now. If you didn't watch the first video and you want to get a more in-depth, detailed explanation and build out this very small counter application, just go ahead and check out the previous video. But just to give us a very quick high-level overview of what we have going on here, if you're just joining us right now, we have this very small counter application just to allow us to experiment with some new React features. We have three different components here on the screen. We have a counter component, which is holding some piece of state that's held in our app component. Then we have two different button components, an increment and a decrement button. And as we click them, the counter goes up or it goes down. And then specifically also, if you look up here in the top, we're also changing the title in our browser tab from neutral when our application first starts to either going up when it's going up or going down when it's going down. Now, let's talk about hooks for a second. The first hook is probably the most commonly used hook in this new set of features that React has put out, which is going to be the useState hook. Now, the reason why useState hook is so beneficial and so powerful is it allows us to do something that was never possible before in React, which is to utilize state inside of a functional component. So essentially, it allows us to take all of this code that we have right here for our app component and kind of shrink it down and make it a little bit easier to read in a functional component without having to go through all of the boilerplate that is a class-based component. So let's go ahead and start experimenting with this. Let's bring in our useState hook and see how it looks. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually rip out all of the guts of this class-based component. We're going to kind of start from scratch. We're just going to make it a functional component right now. So I'm going to go ahead. Welcome back. So we just quickly removed all of the boilerplate for our class-based component for our app component itself, and we've turned it into a functional component. So see right here, we've got our app function. It's returning simply a div with the ID of app and the text that says hello YouTube. So right now in our application, we simply see hello YouTube. So now how do we recreate the stuff that we had before in our class component using our new React hook? So first off, what we can do is we can go up here and we can actually remove the deconstruction or the pulling off of the component from our React library. And we're actually just going to swap that out with useState, which is our first React hook. And useState is nothing magical. It's new in React, but it's nothing magical. And that's one of the things I want to break down today and make it really, really simple. useState is simply a function. That's all it is. In fact, let's go ahead and actually double check that. Let's console log whatever our useState is. All right, let's let our application re-render. And you can simply see down here in our console, useState is simply a function. That's it. And it has a very, very specific purpose, and it returns very, very specific elements that allows us to utilize the functionality of state in our functional component. So let me write out what that's actually going to look like. Actually, you know what, before we do that, let's actually bring in our other components that we have here. So if you remember from our first video, when we were building out this application in the first place, we were returning out three different components: our counter component, our increment component, and our decrement component. Let's quickly take a quick look at those. Those are simply returning a div, which is going to output props.count. So we know we're going to have to pass it some value. Our decrement is also returning a button that has an on-click method of decrement count, and it simply has the text -1. And similarly, in increment, we have a on-click method that's going to be handled that is increment count with a +1. So we know we're going to have to pass in some values to those. So inside of our app component, let's go ahead and return those out right now. We have counter, we have increment, and then we have decrement. Good. All right. Now we're going to see a re-render, and we should see our buttons pop up, but not our counter. Yep, because we're not passing our counter actually any values yet. So let's go ahead and create now that statefulness, that state inside of our app component using our useState hook. All right, let's go ahead and just get rid of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this so we're going to take it really easily, we'll say. We're going to take it very simply first, and we're just going to create we're going to call useState. And useState is designed to take in an argument of whatever we want our beginning piece of state, our initial value of state to be. So in this instance, we're trying to create our piece of state that is count, so we can pass it into our counter component. So we want our initial value to initially be 0. That's it. And the useState method is designed to return some values. It's specifically designed to return an array of values. The first of which, the first element in that array, would be our piece of state, the value that's actually being output of state. And the second value in that array would be a function that allows us to update that state. So really quickly, let's just check out how that looks. Let's say const, let's just call it foo for right now, is equal to the output, the evaluated result of running useState passing in 0 as our value. And then let's console log. Let's console log what that is. Let's see what we got here in our console. All right, so like I said, we have an array with 0 as our first piece, which is what we passed in here, and then a function that allows us to update what this value is when we call it. We'll see what that syntax looks like in just a second. So because it returns an array, and sure, we could utilize those values in that array by saying, foo dot, by saying foo, can't spell right now, foo bracket 0 and foo bracket 1 and utilize those values, but it's kind of a pain in the ass and it doesn't really look that great. So what typically you're going to see happening for this React hook is you're going to see array deconstruction, where we're going to create a const, and the first thing that we're going to put inside that array is whatever we want our first value to be as far as the variable name itself. So you're going to see we can actually just call it count. And then for the second value, we're going to call it change count to save the value, save that function definition that allows us to update that count inside the variable change count. All right, so now if we console log count and change count, we should see those as their own variables now. All right, count is 0, change count is this whole function here. Fantastic. So now let's get rid of those console logs. Now let's utilize those pieces. So we know that we want to pass down count into counter on a JSX attribute called count. There it is. And now we should get our 0 showing up on our screen now. Fantastic. But now we haven't, created any functionality for our buttons. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and do that now. And for that, we're just going to create a couple of functions. We're going to say const, what did we call it before? Increment count. And we're going to set that equal to function definition. Actually, we don't even need to, well, yeah, let's give it some nice spacing right now. So increment count, and inside increment count, we are going to run change count. Remember, that is the function that we got returned from the invocation of useState that allows us to update this count value. And what we pass to it is whatever we want the new value of count to actually be. So in this instance, it's going to be count plus 1. Awesome. Similarly, let's create a const decrement count. We're going to set that equal to function that inside of it, we're going to call change count. And you're going to give it the value count minus 1. Good. Got some switch spacing here. Awesome, awesome. And then let's go ahead and pass those values into our increment and decrement components themselves. So we're going to say increment. We're going to create a JSX attribute called increment. We're going to set it equal to increment count. Similarly, inside decrement, I'm going to create the value, or we're going to set the value equal to decrement count. Now, as long as our naming conventions are proper, which I believe they are, we should be able to now update our count when we click the buttons. Perfect. All right. Now we've drastically shrunken. We've drastically reduced the number of lines of code that we have inside of our app component, excuse me. And we've made our application a bit more readable, to be completely honest with you, using the useState hook. Phenomenal. Now, we haven't rebuilt all of the functionality yet of our application. If you remember, in our first version of the application, when we had a class-based component, we were also updating this title up here from neutral to going up or going down. And we did that through lifecycle methods like component did mount and component did update. So on our next video, we're going to take a short break. On our next video, we're going to bring in one more hook that's going to allow us to do that so that we can get the full function of our application in completely a functional component. See you guys in a few minutes.